Now we have the next session, which we have Professor Henrik Groop from Australia. The lecture titled Regression of Albuminuria and its association with incident cardiovascular outcomes and mortality in type 1 diabetes.
It's my great pleasure to talk to you about regression of albuminuria and its association with incident cardiovascular outcomes and mortality in type 1 diabetes. Before I start, here are my disclosures. Finland, where I come from, has the highest incidence of type 1 diabetes in the world, highlighted in this paper that we published in JAMA a few years ago. And you can see that the incidence rate exceeds 60 per 100,000 people above the age of below the age of 15. So this is the highest incidence in the world. Now we know that type 1 diabetes also comes with complications. And in Finland, we started in 1997 a large study called the Finnish Diabetic Nephropathy study, and we aimed to recruit and thoroughly characterize more than 8,600 individuals with type 1 diabetes. Actually, we have exceeded that number already, and I will tell you the data from this trial when I go back to the regression. So this is a study that covers the whole of the country, 93 centers, and this is actually the population of Finland, and this is where the type 1 diabetic patients come from. You can see very similar, so very close to a population-based study. So the country with the highest incidence of type 1 diabetes in the world, we know that about 1/3 of patients are at risk of diabetic nephropathy. And if you look at the data from our country, you can see that after living with type 1 diabetes for 20, 24 years, there is a peak in the incidence rate, after which it levels off. And this has been interpreted as genetics being behind the risk of developing diabetic nephropathy, which is definitely there, but also the environmental factors are there. But there is a genetic component. If you look at in Finland, the ones that had made it to end-stage renal disease, so they are on dialysis treatment, you can see that is about something between 11%, those that were diagnosed in 1970 or 74, and down to 3-4%, 85 to 99. So not everybody with type 1 diabetes and diabetic nephropathy will enter into dialysis. And if you have lived with type 1 diabetes for more than 50 years, these are data also from the FinnDiane study showing that if you have lived with type 1 diabetes for a very long time, you are not protected from complications. And that is something that is in the literature, that if you live that long, you are protected, but that's not the case. So a subset of the patients with type 1 diabetes develop diabetic nephropathy. Now, the question is, if you have diabetic nephropathy, what are the consequences? And we, in the FinnDiane study, we have seen that if you have microalbuminuria, so albumin leaks into the urine, or you have macroalbuminuria, established kidney disease, or you are ending up on dialysis or having received a kidney transplant, you can see many-fold increased risk of dying early compared to the same sex, same age in the general population. So type 1 diabetes and diabetic nephropathy confers grim consequences. If you look at the standardized incidence rates for myocardial infarction, you can see a similar picture. So the more kidney disease you have, the more likely the patients are to face a myocardial infarction. But you can also see that those without any signs of diabetic kidney disease, they have a slighter increased risk, although they did not have an increased risk of premature mortality. But we also know that patients with type 1 diabetes without kidney disease, they also can have a myocardial infarction. If you then stratify for kidney function, here you can see that the less the kidneys function, the more likely the patients are to face a myocardial infarction. Interestingly enough is that at any stage of albuminuria, so normal, micro, macro, end-stage renal disease, here you can see that the risk of a myocardial infarction is actually the same between the sexes, males and females, at any albuminuria stage. That's a little bit peculiar because we know that men have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease than women, but this is mainly due to the fact that males with type 1 diabetes have a higher risk of diabetic nephropathy. Now, what about stroke? Also the same, if you have albuminuria, the more albuminuria you have, the more likely the patients are to face an stroke event. And if you stratify for kidney function, again, the less the kidneys function, the more likely the patients are to have a stroke. So the natural progression of albuminuria is shown here. You go from normal albumin excretion rate to micro to macro, and then you enter into end-stage renal disease. So this is the natural course. However, there are patients also that regress. So they go back from macro albuminuria to microalbuminuria, or even to normal albuminuria, or from micro to normal albuminuria. So let's have a look. If you do that, if you regress, what are the consequences? So the question is, what is the impact of regression of albuminuria in individuals with type 1 diabetes? This slide shows that in the FinnDiane here, at the baseline visit, when we characterize the patients in the FinnDiane, we go back and take into account all the albuminuria measurements that have been done in the past. And the patients are classified here based on 2 out of 3. So if the patient has 3 samples and they're all squares like this, a normal application rate, that patient would be at the baseline would be considered to be a normal albuminuric. This one would also be normal albuminuric because although 1 is micro but 2 are normal, so patient is normal albuminuric. This one, we have 2 samples, microalbuminuric and 1 normal albuminuric. This patient will be categorized as a microalbuminuric. This one, 2 macroalbuminuric, 1 micro would be considered macroalbuminuric. So this is how we defined or classified the patients at the baseline. So what about then the revised classification? Revised classification was based on 3, but from the baseline visit 2 backwards. So the most recent albuminuria excretion rate values were taken into account. And when you do that, so if you then look at the initial classification in the FinnDiane study, there were more than 2,729 normal albuminuric patients, 438 microalbuminuric, and 475 macroalbuminuric. Now, if you then look at the 3 most recent samples, you can see here that from the microalbuminuric patients, 102 regressed and 333 were persistent. That is 23.3%. And if you look at the macroalbuminuric patients, 475, you can see that 111 regressed and 364 persistent. Interestingly, both in the microalbuminuric and the macroalbuminuric group, 23.3 and 23.4% of the patient regressed. So when you take into account the 3 most recent albumin excretion rates, then you can reclassify the patients because the initial classification was based on all available albumin excretion rate measurements. So let's now look at what was the consequence of regression. And this slide shows the incidence of first ever cardiovascular event. And you can see here by albuminuria stages. So here we talk about nearly 3,500 patients. These are the normal albuminuria patients, microalbuminuria patients, and macroalbuminuria patients. And if you then look at, these are the ones that progressed. And then if you look at those macros, they had a hazard ratio of 5.49 for a first ever CVD event. But here you can see that those that regressed from macro to micro normal, the hazard ratio went down to 3.15. Micro hazard ratio initially 2.62. If they regressed, went down to 1.42. If you then look at mortality by albuminuria status, very similar picture. Here you can see those that went from micro to normal. Here, micro to normal. You can see that the hazard ratio changed quite dramatically because the micro actually patients had a 3.21, but those that regressed 1.41. The macro patients 9.9, but if they went down to micro normal, down to 4.31. So regression means that you actually improve the prognosis of your patients. So what are the take-home messages from this study, the Finnish diabetic nephropathy study in type 1 diabetes, and what are the consequences if you see regression of albuminuria, which is a measure of diabetic nephropathy? So first, I can say that 1/3 of people with type 1 diabetes are at risk of diabetic nephropathy. Progression of diabetic nephropathy confers an increased risk of cardiovascular disease and premature death. But notably, regression reduces the risk to the same level as for those who did not progress. So that is good news. And of course, in the treatment, we should definitely do our best to be able to reduce the albuminuria level in our patients, because at least in type 1 diabetes, that confers an improved prognosis. So ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, that said, thank you for your attention.